Well, hello from the district mental health team. We're excited to spend some time with you today as we share some information about DBT.
We hope you have a couple of resources available right now during this training right at your fingertips. First of all, the deck of DBT cards that were a gift last year, the DBT binder that was delivered to your school, and for those folks who work in our elementary schools, we have sent out a DBT therapeutic activity book to each school for you all to share. If you don't have those in front of you right now, you may want to grab what you can or pause the training and borrow resources from a team member.
So that you can put some names and faces with the voices, we are the mental health liaisons. I'm Amanda.
I'm Wendy.
And I'm Linda.
A little disclaimer here. We participated in an in-depth virtual training with Dr. Lane Peterson to be able to share the DBT information with you so that you can have access to these evidence-based tools and resources.
So this training today is an overview. It's an intro. And if you do want to further explore how to use these tools in different ways or consider yourself officially DBT trained or even certified in DBT, that would be fabulous. I know we're lucky to have a few DBT trained mental health folks among us in our schools, and it's worthy of a deeper dive. And would be something that you would pursue independently. So for this interview, if there are pieces of the content you would like to explore in more depth, we would be happy to create additional useful mini PDs for you if there is interest. So jot those ideas down as we're moving through this training and let us know what has been helpful and what you'd like more of.
So this is going to be the progression of our time together in this DBT overview today. First, we'll touch on the what and the why behind this work. Then we're going to introduce the core DBT skills and draw your attention to the concrete tools and therapeutic methods that you can utilize, and then offer some ways that this material can be implemented with our students.
So let's dive into the obvious first question. What is DBT? DBT stands for dialectical behavior therapy, and that sounds similar to CBT or cognitive behavior therapy, right? They are directly related. CBT is a theory, it's a clinical approach aimed at changing cognitive and behavioral patterns. So DBT incorporates the perspective of CBT. In fact, it's a derivative of CBT. But DBT is heavily skill-based and adds this unique twist of dialectics, which we will explore in a moment. DBT has been shown to be effective with some of the most challenging clinical issues, such as borderline personality disorder, suicidality, and non-suicidal self-injury, or NSSI. DBT is versatile. You can use skills to help a gifted student coping with anxiety, or a student struggling with boundaries or other interpersonal dynamics. It helps with depression, guilt, and anger. It's really flexible in how and with whom you use it. If I sound like a bit of a commercial for DBT, it's because I am a fan. I've used this in private practice work in many different ways and with different ages. And it really is flexible. It's easily accessible. And most of all, it really does work. It's transformational. So in DBT, we frequently talk about skills. We say things like, what skill can you use right now? What skill are you working on? Or what would be a skill you could review that might help you in a situation like this if it arises again? So we teach these skills and then we can refer back to them to integrate the ideas into thinking and active problem solving so they get generalized. Learning the skills can help a student get through stressful times. They obviously don't eliminate stress because that's part of life, but they can definitely decrease its frequency and intensity while the student gains that competence in getting through challenging times or tolerating distress. And more to come on all of that. And as you can see on this slide, the psychological safety you offer when working with students, it's a foundational part of DBT. So here's a visual of a continuum, and both polarities of which can be true at the same time. This shows the fundamental concept in DBT, the dialectic. This example is about how you can fully accept where you are and at the same time be working to change. Both are true. We will come back to some other examples in a few minutes, but for now, just a thought. When we think about some of the developmental challenges our students are going through, this concept of the dialectic and the need to embrace what seem to be opposites really can become even clearer, right, Amanda?
It's very true, Linda. Some of the other dialects that we often see in adolescents struggling to integrate are the strict versus lenient, dependence versus independence, self versus others, responsibility versus fun, and structure versus flexibility. And it's extremely developmentally appropriate for our students. The idea that something can feel very uncomfortable, but also be right and beneficial. The concept that I can be independent, but also to be dependent on others, especially our parents. That not just one has to be true. That I can be doing the best that I can, yet still be struggling. That I can accept where I am, yet strive to grow. This is what the dialectical piece is all about. In this way of thinking, we pivot away from that all or nothing thinking, such as I'm either great or a total perfect success, or I'm a failure. DBT does point out that there are times when we don't seek to find a middle ground. The perfect example of this is if a student is engaging in self-destructive behaviors, or they're actively suicidal, or if they're using drugs.
Okay, so now that we know the most fundamental dialectic in DBT, acceptance and change, it makes sense that the main ingredients or the main skills of DBT would fall into two categories, acceptance skills and change skills. As we go through the skills section of this presentation, you'll notice that many of the skills are meant to help students accept where they are now and how they got there, while others are meant to help students move forward. These skills help provide students with the feeling that they're fully accepted throughout the entire process, while also being committed to change.
Here are some of the DBT beliefs that underlie our work. These core assumptions that the client is doing the very best they can at any given time. Simultaneously, the skills are there for them to do better. And it truly does not matter what caused the problem. It's yours to solve. These skills aren't just for certain things. They apply to all areas of your life. And this final assumption that skills work when we use them. A person can have all the knowledge in the world, but it only matters if it's used. This takes time and practice to master these skills. Just like we practice fire drills, our students must practice these skills so they know how to use them in the moment. There are benefits for both students and student services staff in incorporating DBT into what you do. So we'll leave this slide up for a couple of seconds so you can review those benefits. When looking at whether to infuse DBT into your work with a student, or perhaps even to what level you might incorporate the skills, listen first. What does a student, or how does a student view their challenges? How does the student respond to structure? How reflective and open to suggestion or commitment to change are they? DBT strategies can be incorporated either one at a time into conversation and processing, or taught totally sequentially in highly structured, skill-based psycho manner. And like many approaches, you can incorporate ideas and principles and strategies of DBT without the student even knowing what you're doing. So these are the categories of DBT skills that we've outlined for you in this overview. So we have dialectics, mindfulness, distress tolerance, emotion regulation, and interpersonal effectiveness.
As we go through the skills today, we encourage you to look through the DBT card deck and pause when you'd like to explore your manual for worksheets or more information. We also have the DBT therapeutic activity books that were sent to our elementary schools, so our elementary friends can be looking through that as well. We want this presentation to be as accessible as possible, so please feel free to pause at any time and review the materials that you have, or break up the presentation over time if that's more feasible. And we definitely hope that you'll revisit the presentation as you continue to digest and start to implement the practices. Maybe even consider reviewing the content with a DBT buddy or with your whole team. Okay, so here's the flow of the DBT curriculum. You can follow this flow in your manual, in the DBT cards, and also in the elementary activity book. For this section of the presentation, we've actually color-coded the slides of each skill to align with the card deck, so you can easily follow along with the resources. As we're going through this section, you may find yourself thinking of a particular student and how certain concepts could be helpful. So it might be beneficial to get a pad of paper ready so you can jot those things down. As you're taking notes, maybe even consider what skill would match with that student, or if there are groups of students that would benefit from a particular skill or set of skills. Then later you can review your notes with team members or even just follow up with your own planning. All right, so let's dive in. This core skill aligns with Module 1 in the manual and the green cards in the DBT deck. Feel free to turn to that section of the manual or pull out the green cards and look through them. Taking a look at the dialectic on this slide, we kind of get right to the nitty-gritty of DBT. This idea that the synthesis of opposites leads to a balance in life. Remember what we said about dialectics? That two opposing things can both be true? Like in the graphic on this slide, we see vulnerable and strong. Opposite feelings that can both be true at the same time. A person can feel vulnerable and yet have the strength to persevere. That's the balance. That place on the diagram where vulnerability and strength overlap. Developing the capacity to see this is so important for the mental health of our students. Understanding it can help students avoid jumping to those polarities, like I'm perfect or I'm a failure. Being able to find the balance in the dialectic allows us to stay engaged in growth. It allows us to accept the complexity of things and to see the good stuff in life, even when things are getting bumpy. If that sounds a lot like resilience to you, that's because the DBT skills lend themselves well to developing resilience. If this still feels a bit theoretical to you, let's see if we can illustrate it better with an example. Linda, I know you've used dialectics and practices with students you worked with. Can you share an example with us?
Sure, Wendy. So an example that comes to mind is that I work with a high school student who is really bright, and yet the grades took a nosedive during the pandemic. There are all kinds of factors at play for this student, so the all or nothing thinking, of course, kicks in. My life is over, no more scholarships, my GPA is ruined, my future is hopeless. If the teachers hadn't been incompetent, I would have all A's. Maybe you all have heard students that speak this way. The student is stuck in the externalizing of blame and catastrophizing. So I validate the underlying emotion, and then I steer to this idea of dialectics. When they say something dramatic about their GPA, I can say, yes, your GPA has taken a hit, and that stinks. It's not anywhere near where it would be if there had not been a public health crisis, and you hadn't had all these other things going on. The other part of this is what you did before this happened and what you do from here. You have your cumulative and your weighted GPA, right? What does that look like? So then when they go on about how COVID and their horrible teachers have ruined their life, I say, hey, that was a really rough year and it felt heavy, and we know it's not over yet. Getting through all of this has been so hard. It's so isolating when you were stuck at your house, challenging to be sick and fall behind, to be afraid for the health of your family too. And you know what really impressed me throughout all of this? The way you kept on picking yourself up and are finding ways to turn things around, even if it was at the last moment and in your crisis mode. Even though your GPA did go down some, as it did for so many. So with all of that has been going on, it's been really cool to see that strength and grit in you, even when so much around you has you free falling.
So basically, you're validating where they are, even though there are multiple things that sound contradictory?
Yeah, think of the dialectics that we see with students like this. We have a few of them in our schools right now, don't we? Pandemic and hope. Backwards and forwards. depression and action, anxiety and courage, disengagement and grit. So all these things can be true. And so I bring up the dialectics in the conversation. And of course, as I often find with this particular student, that there's some level of palpable resistance. So I have to remind myself, I'm planting seeds here. I might not see this right away. And I don't push for them to agree with me in the moment. But then, what happens is that I later see these things, my words, popping up in other conversations with the student from their end. And I hear from the parent that they've used my words as their own, which we all know that's the best. Mm-hmm. So there's been a shift in their perspective.
Yeah, that's cool. Thanks for sharing, Linda. And I hope that kind of an anecdote starts to bring the skills more into focus. And of course, there's some prompts, suggestions, and worksheets in the manual and the DBT deck that can support the efforts that you have as you try to teach these skills. But while you were sharing your anecdote, Linda, it started me thinking about the concept of inner voice. I think a lot of us have been exposed to this sort of widespread pop wisdom about listening to our inner voice. I mean, think about times when you've heard your inner voice saying, this feels right, or this doesn't feel right. Or maybe just, this feels uncomfortable. And if it feels uncomfortable, then it's bad. And my inner voice is telling me that I should avoid things that are bad. And then you add in that pop wisdom that's saying, you should listen to your inner voice. That listening to my inner voice is a way of taking care of and protecting myself. So it can be super compelling to comply with that feeling. Mm-hmm. But we also know that feelings get mislabeled all the time. I mean, discomfort does not automatically mean bad. Some things that make us really uncomfortable can actually be good for us. Teaching this concept through the skills of dialectics can really help reshape our inner voice or narrative so we don't end up shutting down or avoiding challenges or flipping to that all or nothing thinking. Okay, so we're just talking about how feelings or emotions can get mislabeled. Let's carry that idea a little further along. In the language of DBT, these ideas are fully explored through the concept of wise mind. Wise mind is the balance between emotion and reason. It's that centered place where we're able to validate our emotions and make effective choices. So let's revisit how that connects to the inner voice we talked about on the previous slide. In a lot of cases, our inner voice is actually the voice of an emotion. Maybe we call it our intuition. Our intuition, or let's say our emotions, are important. They're valid. But they're only part of the story. The other part is reason. Our ability to think logically and make effective decisions. Balancing those two parts of ourselves is to be in wise mind. And wise mind is a key concept in DBT because accessing our wise mind is foundational to our ability to learn and demonstrate those main ingredients of DBT, acceptance and change skills. Since wise mind is foundational to all the other DBT skills, it's something we really want to emphasize and come back to with students after we initially teach it, because it helps remind them to consciously incorporate and legitimize both the emotional and the logical. And a little pro tip here, when you teach the concept of wise mind, think about TV characters that might personify the polarizations of emotion and reason. For me, when I think of the personification of reason, I think of Sheldon from The Big Bang Theory, or Spock from Star Trek. But you guys can probably be more creative than that, or even check out Pinterest for some fun ideas. All right, so check out the change in color on the header of this slide. The core skill of mindfulness aligns with Module 2 in the manual in the sort of magenta color in the DBT deck. Mindfulness. It's trending right now, isn't it? Mindfulness apps and websites are all over the place. There's mindfulness books and journals, all kinds of wonderful resources. Mindfulness is, however, a bit misunderstood at times. Mindfulness is about being present with what's happening. It's not about everything always being peaceful and happy. It's not about blocking out or avoiding challenging emotions. It's actually about riding our emotional waves without getting sucked in by them. Mindfulness is also about learning to steer our attention, to draw focus to our senses in intentional, non-judgmental ways. And actually, successfully practicing mindfulness is how we get to wise mind. So Linda, it's one thing to try to practice mindfulness for yourself. It's another thing to try and teach it to students. Can you share another example from your practice that might demonstrate how that would look?
Sure, Wendy. So just as an example, this is one of the skills that I frequently use when someone is struggling with anxiety or anger or depression. Rather than trying to move the person past their anger in a way that invalidates or represses or otherwise compartmentalizes it, first you validate and you sit with it. So allow it to be there and realize you are not the emotions. Curiosity about the emotions helps. Like, wow, anger is really agitating inside of me. I feel it in my stomach and my heart rate increases and my mind races, my muscles tense up. You learn to sit with that without judgment. You don't feel it with the whole cognitive loop. You learn to witness the emotion inside as it moves through and then leaves. It's validating, and then you don't get stuck like you can when you're trying to move past too quickly out of an emotional rut, or when you marinate in it and just feel justified. This is where I am, and I have a reason to be here. So after observing the emotion, you can then steer the mind and focus on some other local point in the present. Are you listening to, as you're listening to this, you can just pause for a moment, wiggle your toes, and take a deep breath, letting it out slowly. This shift into our body and out of our mind's chatter, it recenters us. It allows us to neurologically return to a less heightened state. So then we can use our prefrontal cortex again and get back to wise mind. We'll explore more of this process in a moment with what and how skills. As a clarifier, finding yourself in wise mind is the goal and allows us to be able to engage more effectively with all the other skills, as Wendy was mentioning. So it's both the goal and a big part of the process. So if wise mind is the goal and the process, how do we get to it? DBT directs us that we get to it through these what and how skills. What skills? To observe feelings, thoughts, urges, physical sensations, behaviors, things in your environment, an overall observation of your experiences in any given moment. Describe, putting your experiences into words in a way that makes it clearer for you and others. Just to describe without adding opinion, you're just describing what it is you're feeling and seeing. And then participate, making mindful choices about what you're doing and practicing those skills until they become a part of you, immersing yourself in the experience. And then we have the how skills. How do we approach or engage with the what skills? We do it non-judgmentally, without label or opinion, being open to new information, focusing on what isn't the good, the bad, the shoulds, but rather looking at just what is. We do this one mindfully, letting go of distraction, focusing your attention and concentration on one thing, and maybe bringing it back, refocusing over and over away from distractions. And then effectively, focus on what the situation or the moment requires, remembering your goals, and do what works to meet them, playing by those rules. So I'm sure you can see as we kind of look at these what and how skills, how mindfulness is really woven through all of these steps. The mindfulness what and how skills are essential. In fact, a small dose of mindfulness practice is recommended at the start of a session with students and at the end. DBT really has a big emphasis on mindfulness. It's understood to be a prerequisite to effectively engage in other skills. It takes you to wise mind, right? So mindfulness is always that thing you can come back to. If a student isn't in wise mind, it's difficult to do anything else effectively. And this makes sense to me when you think of brain functioning, right? So as the path back to wise mind, mindfulness is all throughout DBT and is readdressed and retaught whenever there's a need to increase the effectiveness of other skills.
All right, notice the change in slide color. That's because we're now moving into the purple cards in your card deck. And if you want to follow along in the manual, there are handouts on this skill on pages 51 through 57. So distress tolerance is about increasing the ability to tolerate emotion, being able to witness and then distract ourselves from overwhelm without shutting down and avoiding. It's being able to ready ourselves for action rather than responding with reaction. And it's about learning to manage crisis without making it worse. With an increase in distress tolerance, we can see emotions as temporary states that don't define us. Students should practice this skill when they're not in distress, and maybe make a written plan so they can anticipate some stressors and plan or cope ahead. So when might we use the skill of distress tolerance? To find out, ask yourselves 3 questions. Am I able to solve this problem? Is now a good time to solve the problem? And am I in wise mind enough to solve the problem? If the answers are yes to all 3, great, solve that problem. If the answer to any of these questions is no, then distress tolerance might be helpful until you have 3 yeses and you're ready. Okay, so how do we operationalize and teach distress tolerance? Accepts and improve are the acronyms for a subset of skills in the main area of distress tolerance. We'll briefly introduce these acronyms on this and the next couple of slides, but there's also worksheets in your manual that you can reference and use. So on this slide, we're looking at the skills in accepts, which offer a distraction from difficult emotions. Take a minute to check out these skills and a few of the examples. Pro tip, if you use accepts with a student, encourage them to take a picture of the DBT card or cards, or maybe write out the skill on a note. One other thing to note about distress tolerance, it's a skill that can be really beneficial for harm reduction, meaning there's improvement in the application of skills which reduces the potential for harm during distress. For example, a student engaging in cutting behaviors might use the skills of sensations by holding an ice cube to distract from their distress and draw attention to their senses.
Here's the other acronym that Wendy mentioned, which is IMPROVE. You can review this, and students can take a picture of the card with their phone to remember these skills when in distress. Breaking these down and reviewing and practicing steps when a student is talking through any kind of life stressor can be helpful as well. Students may resonate with only a few of these skills or may find specific ones most helpful. That's okay. The more skills, the better, but one is better than none. Another thing that comes to mind is if you are writing a safety plan, those skills that we're looking to teach students, this could be very helpful there. Another DBT skill that increases distress tolerance is radical acceptance. Acceptance of a challenging event, losses, or changes frees up your psychological, emotional, and other resources to move forward and heal and then rebuild.
So when we're looking at handling difficult truths, Dr. Peterson, who did the training for us, he said that pain plus rejecting reality equals suffering. So accepting reality allows us to free up that energy used in denial towards necessary grief and problem solving. This is a process of turning the mind, recommitting again and again towards accepting things. We all know that feeling when we're in some capacity holding on to something, even though it's gone, or it isn't true, or it's in the past and we can't change it. And this takes our energy. Holding on to things can be little things, like students saying repeatedly in multiple conversations, I just wish they hadn't changed that. Or last year was so hard with everything going on and it wasn't fair. There's still this feeling of rehashing something, of holding on, because you haven't made peace with the fact that it happened and it can't be undone. It could be something really current like, this rule isn't fair, or I wish my dad hadn't just left, or I can't believe I can't go to the movies tonight. This is one way we protect ourselves from adjusting to big changes, right? But if we continue to hold on, we can get stuck. And many times this is something we either don't have control over, this change from the past, or that we messed up and we can't change what happened. So this skill of radical acceptance is the way through this. Mindfulness is a great skill to bring yourself back to what this old thought loop, to when the old thought loop pops up so you can get back to wise mind. It's a move from the external locus of control, in other words, life is happening to me, to the internal locus of control, which is when we feel like we're steering. I'm moving through my life, and I'm choosing the direction I go. So there is a radical acceptance worksheet in the DBT manual, and it's located in the distress tolerance module on page 94.
These skills of regulating emotion come from an increase in awareness and practice with strengthening our ability to handle and steer through our emotional landscape and not get stuck. We're moving into the blue cards in our DBT deck with this information. The pleased skills are foundational steps and can be a first easy entry point into change with our students. For example, sleep is a big one, right? Again, once you teach these DBT skills, you have a shorthand for checking in with students. Hey, how are you doing with please skills? You can review what that means when you need to, but it becomes a word that now represents a whole conversation, and students start to incorporate it into how they think on their own, especially when they know what you're going to ask. So that consistently you come back to it in a totally non-judgmental way, even asking the student to increasingly steer that part of the check-in. So it gets integrated into their thinking and they reflect more and more independently. Just a tip, you can let students take a picture of the DBT card for the skill you're teaching with their phone for a quick reference.
So as an aside, we've actually added technology here onto this as a potential barrier to consider under L. Because handheld personal devices are relatively new, these things often haven't made their way into these kinds of established curriculum and theory like this. But we, as a mental health team, see the need and would love for you to make a note to add this to pleased, so you can assess and help students manage that. We have seen the effect of social media, right, and gaming on depression and anxiety and social dynamics, and we want to make sure to add this in here so it's part of your regular work with students.
Right, in DBT, there's acknowledgement that positive experiences create positive emotions, but changing and increasing preferred emotions doesn't just happen. They're a byproduct of what we think and what we do. You have to invest in positive behaviors to have positive emotions. When we consider building positive experiences, we think about those experiences in two categories. The first category includes short-term experiences that are possible right now. We can support short-term experiences by encouraging mindfulness in the moment, or encouraging a student to create menus of activities that can shift mood or elicit good, healthy emotions, such as music or video playlists, maybe going for a walk, playing with an animal, calling a friend. The other category includes long-term experiences that we work towards step by step. This might be something like learning a craft or how to play an instrument. We know from research that we're happier as humans when we have things that we're looking forward to in the future. And building positive experiences is really a great way to encourage active engagement in the future. So one way we feel competent and in control is to build a sense of accomplishment or mastery with something. Maybe it's something we haven't previously been able to do, or maybe something we've been resistant to for whatever reason. This is something we can all do. If you want to give this a try, just pick a few goals that are manageable, but things you've previously avoided at home or at work, and try to do one of them. Then notice the feeling that follows as you take on and accomplish that goal. It's really empowering to be productive. So you can imagine that when students are able to accomplish tangible tasks, it totally builds their confidence. And genuine confidence impacts everything, including relationships.
You know, Wendy, I keep going back to safety planning. As we continue to grow in the movement toward mental wellness, incorporating these skills into safety plans for students is an evidence way of supporting that work.
Great. Yeah, thanks for the reminder, Amanda.
So this is something that Lane spent some time talking about during our training. It's on page 114 in your manual, and there's a worksheet on page 116. We would just like to take a moment on this to emphasize that with any event, our interpretation or narrative of that event creates a cascade of emotions, action urges, behaviors, and consequences, and then the cycle continues. DBT aims to help at the levels of interpretation, emotion regulation, and also to help manage action urges as they arise. When there are still difficulties with behavior that is expected, this isn't a pass or fail. This is a change step by step over time, with the understanding that as we build awareness and learn to steer our skills, each of those steps creates a little more change in the cycle.
Opposite to emotion skills are super powerful and are great shorthand when talking to students. It's an easy one for them to learn and begin to put into practice. So this starts with the notion that when people get stuck, mood congruent behaviors keep them stuck. If I'm struggling with depression, my emotions will urge me to want to slow down, isolate, and disengage. And these things will take me deeper into depression. If I have anxiety, I want to stay away from the thing that makes me anxious, which we know can increase my anxiety about it. And it feels like staying away is to keep us safe. But the idea is that emotions can lie.
Right, so this skill is about doing the opposite to what your emotions are telling you to do for depression, anxiety, and anger. Be around others, take care of personal needs, engage with the world, and do what's beneficial. There are also opposite to emotion cards in the DBT deck for justified and unjustified guilt, shame, and procrastination. If you guys want to take a look, check out those blue cards in your DBT deck. So at this point, we've layered in several skills and hopefully developed a shorthand for a whole conversation after you've taught the skills. Maybe that would look like validating someone's feelings and then asking, wow, that sounds challenging. Are you still in emotion mind processing that, or have you gotten back to wise mind? Or are you ready to use a skill? What would opposite to emotion suggest? Do you remember why? So you're using all that DBT shorthand to address complex symptoms along with the potential interventions in a really efficient but effective way. I mean, that's pretty cool. So we have our DBT shorthand to talk about skills. Next, we might want to help students start planning for times when they can anticipate a need to use the skills. A great DBT strategy for that is called a cope ahead plan. We can already agree that planning ahead is a helpful strategy for learning from difficulties, anticipating future stumbling blocks, and practicing a response. So we love the DBT flavor of this because it ties together skills, visualizations, and mindfulness practice. A cope ahead plan is something you can use with a student once you've taught the DBT skills, or you can amend it to meet your needs, like if you're problem solving with a student around a particular situation or behavior. And like Amanda's been suggesting, all along, if it's appropriate to put this into safety planning, coping ahead as part of a safety plan is a great tool. This is something that Dr. Peterson introduced several times to kind of pull the pieces of emotion regulation together. Accumulate positives, build mastery, and cope ahead. Do your ABCs. And just as an FYI, in the elementary DBT activity book, they call this laugh skills. So check that out on pages 114 through 118, followed by a couple of pages dedicated to some values work.
As you can see from the color of the slide, we're now moving into the category of our training for the next section of your DBT cards. There are three main sets of skills within interpersonal effectiveness: fast, give, and dear man. When we think of our students that struggle with establishing boundaries, saying no, or maintaining relationships, these DBT skills give a recipe for practice and change. Here's the visual that kind of sets the stage for interpersonal skills of DBT. Each has a piece of helping us interpersonally thrive. Although each of these skills has some layers to it, the gist of each can be summed up as pieces of the puzzle. So 1, what does the other person need in this interaction? That's the give. 2, what do I need from this interaction? That's Dear Man, and probably my favorite. And then 3, what is needed in this interaction to maintain or build my self-respect? That's Fast. Again, it's great as we're flying through these skills for you to be able to look at the color-coded DBT deck and checking out the applicable resources in your binder as well. Pause this training or chunk it as needed. So Fast. Fast is a recipe for self-respect. Check out that second one. I know many of us have that over-apologizing thing. Again, learning this acronym then becomes shorthand with a student, which can prompt them to remember. You're spiraling those conversations, coming back to revisit the skill in connection to the student's experiences, and then they can begin to think differently when they're away from you. So you can hone in on the steps as you talk with a student who comes in about social stressors. You might say things like, it sounds like you're having some changes in your friendships and there's some dynamics that you're feeling stressed about. How skillful are you in using Fast? Which part of that feels extra challenging with all that going on? You want to take a picture of this card with your phone so that you can look at it whenever it comes up. So the give skill is about relationship effectiveness. Genuine. It's about being authentic and real. That's the G. I is interested. So interested is shown by eye contact, reciprocity in interactions, showing interest with posture and voice. And then V, validating is about acknowledging what you heard without judging or fixing the other person. And then the E, easy manner, humor, smile, and relaxed energy. So these are all the steps that we know work. For me, it reminds me of breaking down social skills and talking about what that looks like in practice. So how do students have those conversations using this skill? Our students that struggle with this may not have those steps in mind as images and can require it being spelled out in practice. The acronym can help remind and solidify the learning so that they can more effectively practice when they're away from you, and can obviously differentiate the conversation around this to match with any developmental or functioning level.
Dear Man. Dear Man is one of those skills that help empower our students to put themselves into the equation. It's about goal effectiveness, how to be assertive without being aggressive. So often our students struggle between being overly passive and kind of caught in that child role and not finding their voice, and then when they try to stand up for themselves, there's so much emotion, frustration, resentment that has been built up that they sometimes end up being aggressive. We've seen this with adults too, haven't we?
Absolutely.
So this skill operationalizes how to get what you want in an effective way, and it can be the springboard for more discussion, for role playing, for problem solving around a student's particular needs, for self-advocacy. We know that during childhood there can so often be a feeling of having very little control and little input into the changes in everyday life experiences. So even as an adult, we can forget these things are true, and we can end up staying stuck in unhealthy dynamics. Can we start that over?
Sure.
Thanks. We know that during childhood, there can often be this feeling of having very little control and little input into the changes and everyday life experiences that they have. So even as adults, we can forget that these things on the slide are true, and we can end up staying stuck in unhealthy dynamics. This interpersonal Bill of Rights, it's a reminder that these rights belong to each of us. If these rights are not being honored, that's when we need to use our interpersonal skills to create change. So just as a side note, for those elementary counselors out there, you might see this is kind of reminiscent of the Kids' Bill of Rights in the SSK curriculum. It's also a prevention for all kinds of things to simply know that you have rights. You might seek support from others, increase your peer refusal skills, report dangerous or abusive behaviors, and so on. This is really foundational stuff.
Yeah, I love this, and I know it's the last slide in the skills set, but it feels like a good place even to start sometimes. Yeah. All right, so that was the last of our overview of the core DBT skills. So now we're going to shift our focus to the DBT tools and counseling strategies. We're not going to get too detailed with the tools. They're all in the DBT manual with detailed explanations about how to use and support them with your students. And as we go through, we'll try to reference those pages in the manual where you can find that particular tool or that particular worksheet or a similar one in the elementary activity book. All right, first of all, let's touch base about the diary cards. This is a self-report document that's maintained by the student and that you review together. When used with fidelity, the diary cards can give you a lot of information to help you and the student monitor progress. They can also help determine if there are target behaviors to practice and can drive the agenda for your time with that particular student. The diary cards also give you an opportunity to positively reinforce successes and explore other factors that have been helpful. In structured clinics where they do focused DBT work, the diary cards become an essential part of the treatment. They help steer individual work, they're an important tool to help people self-reflect and take ownership of change. Pro tip here, diary cards work best when the person fills them out the same time every day. Also, most of the categories are pretty intuitive, but there are 3 categories that might need a little explanation. One is called SI, that stands for suicidal ideation, and SIB stands for self-injurious behavior, and then TIB stands for therapy interfering behavior. So if you keep those on the diary cards you use, just take note that that's what that means. Now there's examples of diary cards in the DBT manual, but there are also a number of different diary cards that you can easily access with a simple Google search. Please feel free to tweak the cards or simply skip certain sections in order to target what you need for that particular student or students. You could also use diary cards with check-in and check-out friends, or with a group of students as more of like a weekly reflection. Or you could use it in its original form for students with safety plans or students you know are struggling with self-injury or depression. Just a quick note though, the diary cards have proven to be effective as they are with people in crisis, but you can adapt them as you'd like for those with a different focus. You can probably see that this piece of DBT probably wouldn't be utilized with our younger students without some real changes. So the elementary DBT activity book has behavior charts to track, shape, and target change. They also have some other tools you can use for the student self-reflection piece.
You know, Wendy, some of our self-contained friends get to the point of self-monitoring. So while working with those students, it might be helpful to teach them some of the DBT skills, and then incorporate this card to help encourage the use of learned skills. The tool you use may already look very familiar, or very similar rather, and would likely be an easy transition.
Yeah, that's a good point. So most of our self-contained units do use some kind of a method for tracking progress and rewarding progress, and so the diary card might be really easily adapted for those situations.
So there are a lot of wonderful DBT resources and worksheets included in the materials that we sent you. So we just want to take a couple of minutes and talk about it, or give you a tiny taste to have you explore, so that you can find what will be most helpful to you and what you most jive with. The states of mind worksheets are one avenue to explore and start to understand the interplay of reason and emotion that combines to form wise mind. So you can use this with students or a group of students. The elementary DBT activity books on pages 27 through 29, they're dedicated to the 3 states of mind. So you may remember that pleased is the emotion regulation section. And there are worksheets that allow exploration and tracking. This one encourages reflection on the skills. So how well are they actually utilizing those skills? And the elementary DBT activities book, it has several pages allotted to please. There is a please chart on page 113 in that elementary book. And here's an example of something that you might want to adjust to your needs. They follow the DBT acronym, and depending on the school you serve, you might want to change the avoid drugs category to avoid unhealthy choices, or something along those lines. There is already a category about prescription medication that you can incorporate that prevention piece into. So again, use it as if that's appropriate, or they use it if that's appropriate, or adjust it for your students. Just a thought for some of the elementary ones.
Here's a worksheet with some ideas to build positive experiences. Incorporating fun and novel experiences into your personal work is a breath of fresh air, right? Especially during this time when many of our students have been at home for extended periods of time, and at the very least have had to scale back on their social time. Again, check out Laugh in the elementary DBT activities book, pages 114 to 118. Worksheets for opposite to emotion are super helpful. Again, this is a powerful, immediate skill that gives the experience of not identifying with emotion and helps students make that connection that they can steer and switch to opposite action, rather than buying into the anxious or the angry thoughts and sinking further into the difficulty that they're experiencing. The elementary DBT activities book has some wonderful opposite to emotion materials that's titled Opposite Action. That's pages 103 to 108. Again, I love these DBT cards. I use them with tweens, teens, adults, and even some of our younger students. You can use them to teach or reteach a concept, and then when you're having the other conversations, you make the connections, and you pull out your card and you review it again. I take turns reading them with clients and having the other person read aloud to me. Even in virtual sessions, it works. So you can handle the cards yourself, which obviously might be best during these times of a pandemic, or you can put them out for a group with a bottle of hand sanitizer, perhaps, taking turns to find a skill in a certain color as you work your way through the skills, or you find a skill that you would use to address something happening in their lives to build those connections. Again, you can be teaching the skills in that respect and then connecting experiences to them, or you could be processing experiences and pulling in a skill that applies.
Okay, so now we're going to shift from the DBT tools to a few strategies that might be helpful to consider when you're thinking about using DBT with a student or group of students. Even though we've, kind of been infusing some strategies all along. I mean, Linda, you just gave some really nice strategies. But we're going to go into that a little bit further. All right, if your focus with a student is behavior, you probably want to dive right into the B of DBT. So this slide has some steps you can take when talking through behavior with a student. This is pretty similar to how we already analyze behaviors in our district, but rather than going through a formal FBA, we could use this similar but more simplified process for supporting the student to identify their behavior, make connections, and track changes. Understanding their own behavior on a deeper level and being understood by someone who isn't taking a punitive approach can be really transformative. You can be the safe place, the person that sees the student's heart and helps them align their behavior to match who they actually are or who they want to be. DBT suggests that students commit to engage in the work. Students need to consciously choose to engage for change. This is an underlying tenet of DBT, that the person chooses, or maybe doesn't. You choose as the therapist, and then together you utilize the skills to get to where you want to go. This seems like a small little thing, but it's actually a really big deal because it's asking for a joint commitment to work towards something together. So I don't want, even though we're just kind of putting it out there, I don't want to make it seem like it's not a big deal, because it is. It also can be really empowering.
We all love validation, right? We all understand the importance of it. And one of the subtleties that we want to highlight is that validation is different from normalizing. So we're not comparing the student's experience with somebody else's to let them know that they are not alone. Rather, we are just simply validating their specific experience. I see you. I see where you are emotionally. We aren't fixing it. We are validating where they are. And validation is also different from affirmation. Affirmations can be useful, helpful, if provided with validation of where the person is. But they can be invalidating if a person's feelings are not first recognized. We mentioned this a bit ago. Before you jump straight to a skill, we first need to take that time to validate the emotion. If I jump to redirect your depression with opposite to emotion, before I validate the place you're in, then you won't feel understood. It will feel like I don't even see you and I'm just trying to steer you somewhere else. And that makes people want to push back. And you might actually stay down longer. So validation doesn't mean we're encouraging stuckness. Maybe this is like an important thing to talk about. There may be this fear as people, as counselors and social workers and psychologists, that if we validate someone who is depressed, then they'll feel sort of condoned, like, yeah, I'm stuck, and then maybe more justified in their stuckness, and then they'll stay stuck. Mm-hmm. So that won't happen with validation as a part of DBT because...
Why, Linda?
Oh, thank you, Wendy. It's because we have DBT skills we then pull their attention to.
Right. We validate and then. Like,
yes.
There's always an and. Validate and.
Yeah.
Cool. So we have a sense of what validation is, hopefully, but what does validation really look like in practice? This slide kind of breaks down validation into levels. I'm just going to quickly run through them. Level 1 is just simply giving our full attention to someone, right? This is like that subtle message of closing our laptop, turning towards the person, making eye contact with them. Level 2 is verbally reflecting back what they share. That's a skill we all kind of learn in our practice, is that sort of active listening where we're reflecting back what somebody's saying. Level 3 is commenting on what you notice in their body language. Level 4 is letting them know how their current experience makes sense given their history or even their biology. Level 5 would be expressing how their experience makes sense given the context of all that's currently happening. That kind of speaks to Linda's anecdotes about COVID and the pandemic. So validating that, it's understandable considering the pandemic. Now, level 6 is kind of hard to explain, but I think we all know what it means. It's that level of validation that comes from being genuinely human and making a genuinely human connection. It ensures that the student feels seen, understood, and fully accepted as they are. And this is probably kind of that most natural piece of being a person and being a person that wants to help and wants to connect and move a student forward or a person forward. This part is what comes naturally to us sometimes. And for those of us that don't, we kind of have to drop into it. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And just in case those levels of validation still feel a little theoretical, here's some examples of how the levels of validation might look in a specific example. I'm not going to read all of them, but if you want to read through it, please feel free to pause on this slide before moving on to the next. So we're going to move on, but you can press the pause button if you want to read all of this. Okay, might feel a little bit redundant since we've been talking about how to use DBT skills with students all the way through this presentation. But since DBT is used in clinics, inpatient hospitals, and private practice, we wanted to specifically discuss how it might look in schools, including the different ways it can be delivered, methods for including caregivers, and some other tips and techniques we thought you might find helpful.
So hopefully by now you've been thinking about how you're going to actually do this and what that could look like for you. So what are some structures that we might put into place when we're looking at supporting students through DBT? Do you have some ideas in mind already? Things to put into place for yourself or maybe as a student services team. So here are some examples of how you can use DBT or incorporate this and implement it in your school. So individual counseling is one way to meet the need of our students. This might be as needed with students focused on certain skills. It might be ongoing with students who either don't do well in a group behavior or a group behaviorally, or they just aren't comfortable due to their anxiety, or if there's challenges that are better suited in an individual conversation. Consider a student that may have been identified for counseling as a related service. That might be a good plug in there. So infusing DBT into group work can occur in a number of different ways. You can introduce DBT skills and resources into groups that you already have going around any kind of topic, really. You might design a new group that's focused on one area of DBT, so you might want to do a group just specifically around one skill. For example, if you're working your way through the interpersonal skills, or if you have a student that is not engaging in individual work, you might find that by participating in a group, that they'll be able to actually hear the information and have the safety of not having to be vocal in like an individual setting. So the other way to do a more structured psycho-ed work, either with individuals or groups. So you might simply work through some of the DBT curriculum with a group of students that for differing reasons might benefit from learning the skills. And then you can have those individual conversations using the shorthand of the skills that you might have already taught about and how to put them into practice. So teaching them in groups, but also supporting that individually on side conversations, whether through a check-in, check-out, or just in the hallway as you see the kid. So as we keep mentioning, these DBT tools offer flexibility with how you use them to support students. So you might work through all the tools with the student, or you might incorporate one skill acronym into problem-solving discussion with students that want to talk about one issue only. This is the structure that Dr. Peterson recommends for individual sessions when working with students who may be or have been in skills group in the past. As you can see, it's structured and implies that you would be able to meet weekly if you can. Wonderful. I know not everyone has that ability to, especially today. If that isn't possible, where you are with a certain student, adapt this in a way that is accessible. So make it work for your school, your team, and your student. We wanted to show it to you though so you can see the recommendation when working with a high-need student.
Here's Dr. Peterson's recommendation for the flow of a DBT skills group. As the group facilitator, be mindful about staying focused on the skills building and not getting taken off track by the therapeutic needs of an individual in a group. Obviously, that's when one student is talking a lot and processing their own stuff, so you're going to keep bringing it back to skills. And then keeping an eye on contagion and making sure that any group contagion is positive. Doing straight skills teaching without the personal homework review in group is another option. And then you can follow up with individual conversations, but save time by teaching the skills to a group of students at once. You're just working through the skills, teaching the skills, and then you can do individual work and kind of use your time a little.
Yeah, I think that what's nice about the psychoeducation piece is you're sort of setting some groundwork. And so you might identify that there's some students that would benefit from this, and then maybe one of those students is sent to you later or you come across later, and you can kind of bring those skills back, as part of that shorthand or just as a reminder to use the skill to problem solve a particular situation. I feel like everyone could benefit from the DBT skills. So it doesn't really matter if there's a crisis or if something's happening. It's really these are just human skills. How do you interact with the world around you in an effective way? So I think the more we can teach this, the better for all of us. Well, so just like with almost everything we do with students, whenever possible, we want to include caregivers and families in the supports that we're providing. Their buy-in is often critical to creating sustainable change. There's a caregiver section in both the DBT manual and the elementary activity book, so those resources are going to be really helpful too. And you could also use those resources with teachers or administrators or anyone really who might benefit from the information. In addition to what's available in the manuals, we found a few videos that we're going to show you in a minute. So beyond the obvious, why else might we want to include caregivers in DBT? Well, teaching the dialectic concept to caregivers can be super helpful, especially with adolescents and teens. It can be incredibly challenging for families to find the healthy balance between independence and dependence, or strict and lenient. In the end, some caregivers simply let go because they don't know how to gradually release.
So I have an example of that, Wendy. I have a client that I've been teaching sensory skills to. One day my client was having an anxiety attack. She called her mother and was completely heightened. Now, because I had taught her mother about using the ice to distract herself, she was able to remind her to get some ice and then do something mindfully. The client was able to use her coping skill and de-escalate herself. It was really beautiful. It was really great to see a person take a skill and actually put it into action and show that it actually does work. So now, had I not shown that or shared that skill with her mother, she may or may not have been able to talk her down. So one thing to remember, that is through the accepts skills
section. Yeah, I was just going to ask you that because you mentioned that you've been teaching sensory skills, and that sensory piece is part of the accepts skill set, which is a distraction method. Those are distraction methods.
Absolutely. And teaching her mother that skill allowed her to help de-escalate.
Yeah, that's great. And again, just another example of why it's important to include caregivers. They're the ones that spend the most time with their kids.
Absolutely.
All right. So caregivers are people too, and they have stress responses of their own. Helping them understand the concept of wise mind can help them become more aware of their own emotional states, and then hopefully better understand and manage their emotional regulation. I found this video on YouTube, and I thought it was a cute way to talk about wise mind with families. If you like it, share it with your caregivers or when appropriate. We're going to have links to all of the resources that we've gone through, including these videos on the Canvas or My Learning page that's connected to this course. So we'll go ahead and show you the video, and if you like it, you can grab the link on the Canvas course.
Wise mind refers to a state of mind, or a state of being, where you are the wisest and make the most effective decisions. We want you to learn how to recognize wise mind and how to get into that state on purpose, even when you are upset. First, let's distinguish wise mind from two other states of mind that we're frequently in: emotion mind and reasonable mind. Emotion mind is the state of mind when your emotions control your thoughts, urges, and behaviors. When you're in emotion mind, your emotions dictate your responses, regardless of your long-term goals. With anger, you might lash out at someone or engage in road rage behavior. When you're in emotion mind with sadness, you might stay in bed all day and neglect your responsibilities. There are certain vulnerabilities that make you more likely to be in emotion mind, like being tired, hungry, physically ill, stressed, or under the influence of drugs or alcohol. Reasonable mind is a state of mind where reason and logic control your thoughts, urges, and behaviors. When you're in reasonable mind, facts and logic dictate your responses. When you're in reasonable mind, you might demand things go a particular way that you feel is right, according to the facts. Maybe reasonable mind sounds good to you, though you have to remember that logic and facts devoid of emotions means you lose your sense of values and empathy. So in reasonable mind, you might not realize that another person is upset and do what's needed to help them. Wise mind represents the integration of emotion mind and reasonable mind. It is knowing the facts and logic in a situation as well as tuning into emotional and sensory experiences. Similar to intuition, wise mind is often described as a centered, gut feeling felt in the body. Finding your wise mind can take a lot of practice. To practice getting into wise mind when you're in a different state of mind, you can do a number of things. One is attending to your breath coming in and out of your body, and focusing your attention into your center at the bottom of your breath. You can add the words wise and mind to your in-breath and out-breath. Another exercise is to ask wise mind a question. Breathe in, silently ask wise mind a question, and when you breathe out, just listen without giving yourself an answer. Just notice what answers come up for you. As a skill, wise mind can be incredibly useful for getting you to a more centered place where you can act more effectively.
Okay, again, if you feel like that's a helpful video, you can find the link on our My Learning course attached to this DBT training.
Mindfulness is a powerful skill for caregivers as well. As we know, sometimes stress response from parents can escalate a child's behaviors. If a parent is able to use mindfulness exercises, it can really alter a child's entire world. We can see students go from a constant state of fight or flight to a relaxed state just by teaching caregivers these skills. This can take families from a fix my kid mindset to a healed family. So here's a video that you can share with families if it would be beneficial. When I work with a minor in practice, I like to not only share the skills that I have taught their child, but I also like to teach the parents some skills to help them when they're struggling to keep their cool with their kid.
Mindfulness is about being fully present and awake in this one moment. There are 3 specific what skills that you can use. They are called the what skills because they teach you what to do when you practice being mindful. The first what skill is called observe. Observing is simply just noticing. It is paying attention to the information that comes through our senses in this one present moment. We can observe sights, sounds, tastes, touch, smells, and sensations, as well as thoughts or feelings. Observing is just noticing this sensory information without adding words on or trying to change or add anything to it. Just notice. You can try this by noticing what sensations you are experiencing now. Stop, take a breath, and observe the sensations of your body. Warmth, coolness, tightness, pressure, movement. You can practice observe for a few seconds at a time or for many minutes. The second what skill is describe. This is to describe what you have observed by putting words to the experience without adding judgments or interpretations or anything other than what you observed at the level of sensation. We say that you cannot describe what you haven't observed. So if you were to describe the sensations of your body, you might say tightness in chest, nostrils constricting, abdomen expanding. On the surface, this might sound pretty straightforward, yet it's extremely difficult. From a very young age, most of us are taught to judge experiences as good, bad, right, or not right. The describe skill is intended to get us away from all that because we can't directly observe the mental concept of goodness, so therefore we can't describe it. Instead, what you can observe and describe is, the thought that this is bad has gone through my mind. One potential pitfall occurs when we attempt to describe our own emotions and thoughts while adding on to what we actually observe. For example, when you experience feelings of sadness, you might tell yourself this is the worst you've ever felt and it will never get better. If you wanted to shift that using describe, you could instead say you notice sensations of heaviness in your chest, and you are having the thought that it won't get better in this moment. See if you notice a difference in your own reactions when you practice this skill. The third what skill is participate. Participate is throwing yourself into whatever you are doing in this one moment and becoming one with the experience. It is the opposite of multitasking or trying to do many different things at the same time. It involves letting go of self-consciousness, criticism, and worry about what you should be doing, and instead being completely in the moment. For example, to be fully participating in a conversation with someone would mean putting away all distractions like phones and just being with the other person in the conversation. Participating means throwing yourself into this one moment without planning what you're going to say next or worrying about something that happened earlier. Participating involves riding out urges to do anything else and refocusing on this one moment. When you are practicing the what skills, remember that you can only do one what skill at a time. The what skills are best learned through practice and will help you take a hold of your mind.
Okay, so I hope that some of that sounded familiar from some things we've already talked about when teaching students the DBT skills, but hopefully those would be helpful videos to share with caregivers as well.
So here's this dialectic piece again. Check out the video as another resource to share with home and or teachers, any staff in your school.
The core principle of DBT is dialectical philosophy. So in a nutshell, dialectical philosophy is walking the middle path. It also entails looking at all sides of a situation, all points of view. Moving away from black and white thinking, such as always, never. Kids, they're trying to learn their emotions. They're up and down all the time. And so those extremes can also kind of push the parent to be real extreme too. And the goal here is to kind of like find that middle path. Meet that middle ground as a kid, as a parent. There's quite a few different dialectical dilemmas. Those dilemmas are the kind of polarization I'm talking about. The first one is being too loose versus being too strict. The number two is kind of making light of problem behaviors versus making too much of the typical teen behaviors. And the third one is actually forcing independence, kind of pushing, and also holding on too tight or fostering kind of dependence. So the key is finding that balance. Being too loose versus being too strict. And so being too loose means too few demands, not many rules, not many limits in the home. Then you have the other extreme where you have way too many demands, really strict, and there's no flexibility in the home. So the goal for us as clinicians is helping parents find that balance. As a parent, you might let your kid do whatever they want, like coming home late or slacking off on homework. And then for whatever reason, you kind of hit your breaking point. You go to the other extreme and go, hey, I've had it with you, and you're grounded for a month. That's pretty extreme. Like one extreme was you're kind of pretty relaxed, and the other extreme, you're kind of grounding for the month. So when you think about it, does this really work? I was with this family, and they had a daughter. I think she was around, like 15. The daughter insisted to staying up past midnight. She also even got to the point of asking to stay at her boyfriend's overnight. And the parents responded, but like, no way. You're not even gonna have a boyfriend. You're not even like have a boyfriend until you turn 18 or until you turn 35, whatever. And so they responded in a pretty extreme way. So what is the middle path in that? So middle path would be, okay, of course, staying overnight at a boy's house is definitely inappropriate. So that's off the table. So what is appropriate? Maybe the girl spending time with her boyfriend with the family so the family can get to them. Maybe if she gets her homework done, maybe she can stay past 10 o'clock texting. To me, as long as they're getting their stuff done, taking care of business and having good relationship with mom and dad, I think we need to really be flexible. And I think when you're willing to come to the table a little bit, your daughter or your son is willing to come to the table as well. I think I've seen parents be really too tight, and that's when they lose their kids. Key here is finding the middle path and avoiding those extremes, because extremes lead to this polarization that I talk about in our relationships with our teenager. And when this happens, you've lost influence. We all know we don't control our kids, but we do have is influence. And the key is maintaining the influence we have as parents with our children. So the second dialectical dilemma is making light of problem behaviors versus making too much of typical teen behavior. When we're making light of problem behaviors, refers to minimizing serious behaviors, such as drug use, such as self-harm, such as even like suicidal ideation. Because a lot of people say, oh, all teens think they want to die. No, that's not true. I think it's a myth. So that's making light of that stuff. Then the other flip side is kind of where we're making kind of too much of typical teen behavior, means arguing, means not doing your homework, or not being compliant, or pushing back. That's typical teen behaviors. So the key is helping the parent regain that sense of what's normal, what's not normal for teenagers. Third dialectical dilemma is forcing independence versus holding on too tight. We feel the need of, oh, you turn 18, all of a sudden you have to be independent. I think we might have forced independence too quickly because of they turn 18. And the other end, holding on too tight means continually to rescuing, maybe continually to not hold your daughter or your son accountable. Just not allowing that child to kind of be independent. Because ultimately as a parent, our goal is to help our kids become independent. That's our main job as parents. So for example, you have a girl and she is 17, kind of going to be 18, and unfortunately she gets pregnant. And so during this whole time, parents didn't provide any kind of consequences, didn't really hold this girl accountable, and then she gets pregnant and they say, okay, you're pregnant, you're out of here, we're kicking you out. So you see that kind of extreme where they've been kind of parenting this child by not holding limits and boundaries, and all of a sudden when a negative consequence occurs, they want to kick them out and make this child independent. And so the key is here is that in this situation, of course, it'd be better to hold better boundaries beforehand, but in reality, she's pregnant now, so what do you do? So now it's good to kind of like turn to weaning her to be more independent and kind of slowly move from kind of that fostering independence to independent. But don't expect that kid to kind of automatically be independent, kind of get them to that point. The families I work with, I really believe they have great innate knowledge of being good parents. So it's not about necessarily like they don't have parenting skills, it's more about emotional functioning. So I really believe that one of the best things you can actually teach a parent is just knowing how to manage their emotions. There are many different types of dialectical dilemmas in parenting, in addition to those three main categories I talked about. So regardless of the type of dilemma, it's really important to find the middle path. I mean, when you're parenting your teen, and not to be overreacting or underreacting. So when parents find this kind of like, get away from these extremes, this world opens up with their daughters. Their daughters are a lot more responsive. Their daughters really relax and loosen up more, and their relationship grows tenfold. We work with great parents, and I think when you've gone through the experiences they have, I mean, the parents have been traumatized, not just the kids in this process, and they lose sight of what that balance is. And I really believe one of the wonderful things that Sunrise does is help parents find that balance again as parents.
So that's a lot, right? We've just shared a few different videos with you that are great resources, and kind of like Wendy was saying, I believe we've gone through these principles with you today, so I hope that's kind of solidified those concepts and skills and even more for you. The training we took with Dr. Peterson was around 24, 25 hours.
Something like that.
So we've really tried to pare it down for you to give you what is most applicable, most useful for you, and try to figure out how to present it in a way that makes it immediately accessible. And we really hope that this has been helpful.
I know that we keep saying this, but DBT is very flexible in how you use it. Most importantly, perhaps, is to understand the underlying principles. So dialectics, wise mind, the importance of a student choosing to do the work, and the essential component of a professional who shows full acceptance of the student wherever they are in this process. We teach skills and plant seeds, but again, the student has to actually use the skills. Remember, we practice when we're calm so that we can remember when we are in crisis. Dr. Peterson's materials are not copyrighted, and he's open to you copying and changing material in order to help students. Some of the resources he may have gotten permission to use from another person, so if something is copyrighted in your materials, make sure you follow the necessary procedures and ask permission to make copies.
We hope you've enjoyed this and that you've gotten into that binder and the DBT deck so that you can use them even more moving forward. Please post a comment, add something to the Padlet about what was helpful and what you want more of.
We're happy to support your growing practice with DBT. It's effective with even the biggest mental health challenges. So try it out and practice. Put your materials where you're most apt to reach them. Set up a student group with a colleague that would also like to engage with these tools so that you have a practice buddy. Perhaps there's a student or a group that you believe would benefit from this. We hope you invite them to do this work with you.
I know we've all seen over the years that there are a lot of approaches and tools and curriculum that come and go, and we hope you see DBT can be a lot different than that, and that you can find a way to revisit this content, practice it, and use it with students, and gradually perfect the process to best fit you and your professional practice. But no matter how you use this information, please know that we got your back. Let us, as the district mental health team, know how else we can support you in this incredibly important work that you do every single day. Take care, everyone.
Stones we carry